All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are bringing both a new topic and a new guest onto this channel, my good friend Justin M. Lesniewski. He's here with me to discuss art, specifically the DC Warner Brothers film franchise that just fell apart in the most frustrating way with the release of the butchered Justice League, half Joss Whedon, half Zack Snyder mashup monstrosity. So Justin here is the creator and host of Welcome to the Midside, an arts and culture podcast that focuses on romanticism, particularly in film. You can find the podcast on iTunes or at themidside.com, where Justin also blogs about film and television. Justin is also a screenwriter and filmmaker himself. He has a web series called How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse that can be found at howtozombie.com. So, hi, Justin.
Hey, it's great to be here. You make me sound awfully impressive with that intro. I really appreciate that.
No problem. I am glad to have you on. You've had me on quite a few times on the podcast, so I'm glad I could return the favor. If you have already listened to Welcome to the Midside, you already know how I feel about the Justice League movie. I was on there giving my thoughts along with a couple of other people, which I think was quite interesting. We'll link to it below, as well as link to all the other stuff I just mentioned, so you guys can track it down. But all the ways that the movie sucked have been discussed 6 ways from Sunday at this point, in my opinion. So what I really brought Justin on to talk about is, why did it suck? Or rather, how did Zack Snyder's vision become so eroded and eventually completely subverted in a way that doesn't even make sense economically for Warner Brothers? It's quite a story, in my opinion, and I think in some ways it belongs right up there with Syria hoax as far as conspiracies go. And I think it holds important lessons for anyone who's aspiring to make great art in the current SJW converged world of the culture makers. So Justin, you're not an insider with any special knowledge, but you have followed Snyder's career closely for a long time. And as an artist yourself, you see this crazy Fountainhead style arc that went down over the last year for Snyder. Do you think this background stuff can explain the experience that I and a lot of other audience members had watching Justice League, where it was just like thing after thing after thing that didn't make any sense?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the biggest problems with Hollywood in general that's been well tracked beyond when we have these Frankenstein movies is that you have studio interference where they're so worried about marketability. I mean, we saw this with Rogue One, right? Where they basically reshot all of Act 3. They brought in a whole new director and reshot all of Act 3 to make it much more marketable. And then you bring in the characters of, and I say characters facetiously, the characters of Geoff Johns and Joss Whedon, who then have an agenda that they're taking advantage of this studio mentality where they're not worried about art and they're worried about the bottom line, where they don't understand that if you worry about art in the long run, the bottom line will be better. You have Johns and Whedon then creating this monster mashup of not only aesthetic, which is usually what the studios do. You just have these movies that are like all over the place where it's just, from a technical standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And I mean both like technically as far as lighting, sound, all of those elements, but technically as far as writing. Then you also have, from a philosophical perspective, from a thematic perspective, you have it all over the place. And when you have a Zack Snyder who is an anti-SJW, basically, you look at Snyder, Nolan, they're good friends, they're Christopher Nolan, they're anti-SJW, and then you put that in a film with Joss Whedon and Geoff Johns, like, those are just two complete opposites. So there's just, on so many levels, this whole story, and it's a wonderful story in itself. I mean, you could make an amazing documentary, I think, about Zack Snyder's experience in the DCEU. This entire story itself lends to what you saw on screen, and anyone who's honest watching it on screen was just going, what is this? I can't even get a grasp, because it creates too much cognitive dissonance.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. And you mentioned Christopher Nolan already, which was on my mind because I have to wonder if all of this started to a lesser degree all the way back with Man of Steel. I know Warner Brothers originally turned to Snyder because Christopher Nolan recommended him. But I find it hard to believe that they ever really got what either of them were doing artistically. It was just a money thing at best. And Man of Steel made money and was a good film, but that was definitely where we saw this narrative first being formed among I don't even want to say that they're comics fans, because I don't think that's what they are. Like these sick in the head SJW critics who started pushing this idea that Snyder betrayed the Superman character and therefore betrayed the fans.
Yeah, it definitely starts all the way back with Nolan. In a way, I would call Snyder the hip American version, the hip young American version of Nolan, where they very much have similar sensibilities. They have similar approach to filmmaking, but Snyder is just more in your face and aggressive. And whereas Nolan is very British, he's more understated. He doesn't go in the, sort of the aggressive way. I mean, look at the way Nolan dresses versus Snyder, right? And Snyder's all tatted up. Nolan's not tatted up. You can just see it in their personalities. And the studio had a huge success with the Dark Knight trilogy. Like that exceeded anyone's wildest dreams. And then after that, they wanted Nolan to do the Superman reboot, but he didn't want to do it because he probably realized what Snyder didn't, which is how many years of your life does it take up to do one of these trilogies? I mean, how many years did it take to release the Dark Knight trilogy? And then how many years has Snyder been working on the Justice League trilogy, which the Superman trilogy really is what he was going for. And Nolan didn't want a piece of that. So he brought in David Goyer, who is another writer that all these SJWs hate, that all of these critics hate, these elitists in Hollywood supposedly hate, is David Goyer. And he wrote large parts of the Dark Knight trilogy. And he's written other movies, and he's written directed other movies. So he brought Goyer in, and then he brought Snyder in. And he told Warner Brothers, and he said, this is the guy to do it. And because Snyder had a friend, Greg Silverman, at Warner Brothers who had helped Snyder and supported him since 300, which we remember that was Snyder's hit that brought him into the mainstream. That was his second movie. Snyder had basically carte blanche to make Man of Steel. And he came up with something very subversive. And then from that point on, the cultural machine went to work. And people started jumping on it to go against it. And if you also notice, Nolan's involvement, starting with Man of Steel, going all the way to Justice League, became less and less to his name isn't even on Justice League. So these are certainly not coincidences that Nolan was there in the beginning. There are references in interviews to Nolan having creative conversations, specifically about the murder of Zod. And I say murder, but I really shouldn't have used that word, about killing Zod to protect the humans. There were interviews where Snyder says, yeah, Goyer and I talked to Nolan and we presented the argument and we convinced him, and Christopher Nolan understood that that was the best dramatic way to go. And as we saw in the wake of Man of Steel, that was one of the two main critiques of the movie, was the killing of Zod and the destruction of Metropolis in the final battle, like they were Greek gods.
Right. And I thought there was this one, we've talked about before, but this one preview for Man of Steel that I can't find, so I'm not 100% convinced that it actually existed. But I vividly remember seeing this preview because it convinced me not to see the movie. And the preview involved sort of Superman floating above Earth with like light behind him from the sun, and Jor-El giving a voiceover talking about like giving his only son like onto Earth in this very like Jesus thing. And then the movie itself ends up subverting that, or inverting, I guess you could say, inverting that whole Jesus myth. And it's very well done, and that's why I ended up liking the movie. But it's one of the areas where I kind of wonder if like there was some influence in the studio that kind of didn't quite get what was going on. And maybe at the time Snyder was naive and he thought like, oh, that'd be cute. Like it'll be kind of cute to like make a preview that's like, oh, look, classic Jesus myth. And then have the movie be like, just kidding. It's like something different. And in my opinion, a lot better than that. But then, you know, there's a huge faction of people in the culture who just, you do something like that, they don't like to feel fooled, right? Like they're very insecure. So if you do something clever and invert their expectations, they don't go like, oh, wow, cool, or like, what a twist, or, you know, something like that, or how creative. They go like, hey, fuck you for making me feel stupid.
I'm laughing really hard right now because you said the "what a twist," which is M. Night,
right.
M. Night Shyamalama Ding Dong.
Exactly.
For Robot Chicken, they did that sketch. But one of his films had suffered this same problem.
Exactly.
I was wondering if
the same thing happened to him. Yeah.
Right. With The Village, people did not get the twist of that movie. People think the twist of that movie is the year it takes place in. No, the twist of that movie is the people you think are the protagonists, the village elders, are the antagonists. They're the villains. You think they're the heroes. They're protecting everyone, but they're really hurting them. That's the twist. And the movie was sold as something completely different. And because people were expecting this horror film and they got this dramatic film, they, as you said, they didn't like feeling fooled, and they act like that movie is terrible. So I think that Snyder being naive is inarguable. If you look at this entire arc, as we're saying, this documentary arc, him being naive is inarguable. I think he was protected in the beginning by Nolan and Silverman and by his wife. So that's inarguable. Was he, in this instance, involved with the marketing? I don't have information on that. I don't know if anyone has maybe we could get someone to say that. But certainly the studio sold the typical Superman myth, right. Whereas what we ultimately got was, this isn't a Superman who's fighting for all of us, right? He's not dying for our sins. He is fighting for himself and protecting his values. And for me personally, I've been a Zack Snyder fan for a long time. 300, Sucker Punch, these movies convinced me to love him. But one of the biggest things I was concerned about was, in today's day and age, I said, how can we have a superhero who stands for truth, justice, and the American way? And how is Zack Snyder going to do that and not alienate me as a fan if he doesn't do it, or alienate the common culture if he does do it? And then he did make this brilliant American Superman where he is fighting for his values, where his dad in Kansas says, no, you have to do this for yourself. Make sure it doesn't harm your life. Do it when you're ready. You're not obligated to do this. This is your choice. And that was what people ended up getting. And Snyder made an effort, and I do believe this is his own sort of worldview because he comes from like a Christian Science background. I believe he made an effort to mediate between Christianity and a more rational, self-interested point of view. And when people got that, they didn't understand that. Or they did, even worse. I do believe they did understand it because I'm starting to see write-ups and such. Dalton Ross, I believe it is. No, Doc Jensen. Doc Jensen over at Entertainment Weekly recently did a quick blurb about Jonathan Kent's death scene in Man of Steel, where he nails it exactly. He says exactly what it's about. And he says, and this is a paraphrase, it's not an exact quote, but he says that people were upset because it's not what they're typically expecting. But it made for intense drama. So I do believe people got it, and that this was the first sort of backlash we started to see. And then they, as I said before, they really latched on to the killing of Zod and the Metropolis battles as their ways of concretely attacking the movie, rather than attacking it's very hard to say we don't like Superman because he's self-interested. Instead, they said we don't like Superman because here's examples of him being a bad person.
Yeah, that, and I think Jonathan Kent's death was another big one that people complained about, and that basically the fact that Superman didn't go out and save him, but he wasn't Superman at that point, which is, again, kind of the point.
Right, and then people say Jonathan Kent is bad in that scene, and it's like, that's the point. He's flawed, and that goes into Batman versus Superman. The point is he's flawed, and he's telling you the world is going to hate you, so you should hide. And what obviously Superman learns in Batman versus Superman is it's not about other people, it's about what I want to do. This is my world. But that's the lesson his dad taught him that kept him in hiding in Man of Steel. There's no conflict for the Superman if he's like, oh, I'm Superman, and then I'm going to save the day. Like, the conflict has to be whether he wants to use his powers or not. Otherwise, I mean, I've always hated Superman because he was boring for that reason.
Yeah, same.
Right? It's always just like, hey, I'm super powerful and I'm going to show up and I'm going to beat anyone. Well, where's the story? There's no drama in that. So that's what Snyder put in there. That's what Goyer put in there, was the idea of he has to decide why he wants to use his powers. And they gave him a rational reason, but people didn't like the rational reason.
Right. So sitting in the audience, I first started wondering what the heck Warner Brothers was doing when it came more to Batman versus Superman. Because what ended up on the screen in the theater was just, I mean, it wasn't nearly as obvious as with Justice League, right? But it was clear that a lot had been cut. And compared to what I expected to see from the previews and from other things that I knew, I knew a lot was missing, right? Even just from knowing who was cast in it, who didn't end up actually showing up. And so much was cut that it seems a lot of audience members couldn't even follow what was happening. And I felt like I was taking crazy pills because the anti-Snyder people in the media were saying how terrible Snyder was for presenting his initial cut, and I don't remember how long it was. I don't even think it was quite 3 hours, right? It was like 2 hours 45 minutes or something like that he originally proposed, and then the studio came back and was like, no, you need to cut it down to like 2.5 hours or something like that. And the critics still complained about it being too long, even after doing that. And I just remember thinking like, okay, Titanic was 3 hours and 15 minutes. And that came out when I was a child. And literally every girl in my class saw it. Like most of them saw it probably like 5 times. Avatar, 2 hour and 45 minutes. And that felt a fuckload longer because it sucks so bad. But it's like the highest grossing film of all time or something. The Dark Knight Rises from Christopher Nolan, 2 hour 45 minutes. And they love to talk smack about how Nolan knew what he was doing, but Snyder doesn't. So don't tell me people don't watch 3 hour movies. You know, people don't watch movies that don't make sense and that they can't follow. So this was the first time I saw a decision where I was like, you know, obviously from an artistic perspective, doesn't make any sense. But from a business perspective, it doesn't even make any sense. It's like, why not just release the movie that you actually made? Why would they do that? Why would they take this big chunk out of a movie that's, you know, not exactly an outlier in length?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things. What I heard is the business rationale was that if you have shorter movies, you can have more showtimes in a day so you can make more money. I'm not an insider. I don't know how true that is or not, but that's the rumor. But when we think creatively, what I think of is just my reaction to the movie. I mean, you sort of hinted at your emotional reaction. But when I sat there in Batman vs. Superman in theaters the first time I saw it, I had to do a lot of work myself. And what I mean by that is, initially, I felt very jarred. I felt very out of place, like something was missing. It was very disconnected to me. And eventually I settled on, oh, we're being told 3 stories here, Lex, Bruce, and Clark, and then they combine. And then when they combine from that point on, the movie makes a lot more sense and it doesn't feel as disconnected. But then when I watched the Ultimate Edition on DVD, on home media, it was very clear that they cut out all the transitions of this movie in order to make it quicker. And that creates, as I said, and this was again amplified in Justice League, this cognitive dissonance. So they definitely were doing it for this arbitrary runtime, which we again saw in Justice League, which they were trying to with a 3-hour movie, and Batman vs. Superman was about 3 hours. The rumored Zack Snyder cut of Batman vs. Superman is about 3 hours, and they wanted 2 hours. So again, they're cutting down for this arbitrary length. But also in Batman versus Superman, they cut out a lot of the subtlety of the Africa scene, where it was clear that it was being manipulated to make Superman look bad. Which now we have this sort of irony in the world where Snyder's Superman was being manipulated to look bad. So they cut all that out, and that was very intentional. You know, they say it's confusing for people, but they were trying to streamline it, and they were trying to simplify, again, the interesting conflict. And the interesting conflict of the movie is as Batman, as a human and a hero, has to reassess his place in the world now that there's someone more powerful than him. And what does he do? Does he trust that now he's no longer the most powerful man in the world, that everyone else can be good? Because before, it's a lot easier to trust yourself, right? And say, oh, well, I'm good, so I'm not going to do anything wrong. But to have someone more powerful than you, who especially caused you trauma with the Battle of Metropolis, and they cut all that subtlety out and just made it about, like, Batman's this evil killing machine, which is, again, that was the critique, one of the major critiques they latched onto with the movie.
Yeah, there are so many people and it was interesting because, as I know you know, I don't know, well, I guess I don't know who specifically it would have been, but the makers of Batman vs. Superman sat down and counted the number of people that Batman killed in Batman vs. Superman, and they compared it to the number that he killed in the Christopher Nolan movies, because he does kill people in the Christopher Nolan movies. It's indirectly, he doesn't, execute people, but people still die. And it came out exactly the same. I mean, they took that as a benchmark, right? So once again, you see this kind of, people like to compare it to, they're like, oh, this isn't Batman because he's killing people. And it's like, but no one said that about the Christopher Nolan movies when the same thing was happening.
Yeah, there's something I don't...
But again, like you said, the American thing, it's more intense.
Yeah. And I don't, there's something I don't understand. And again, I don't read comics, so I don't want to pretend like I have knowledge of it. But in my whole life, I've never understood Batman as non-killing, and I've never understood Batman as the world's greatest detective. But these are the two things I started reading the most online after Snyder's Batman got released, was the idea that, oh, Batman should be the world's greatest detective, and Batman has a no-killing pact, and he has a no-guns pact. And everything I've seen, and my interactions with that before was, you know, the original Burton movies plus the Schumacher movie, which I guess we don't really discuss. But then there was some different cartoons, you know, rides at different theme parks. Then there was the Nolan trilogy, and in none of those did I get either of the impression of either of those. So it's like we're being told that you can have subjective interpretations of art, but then people are saying their subjective interpretation of art is the best. So, oh, you can have whatever version of characters you want, but if it's not my version of Batman or Superman, fuck you. And this is, you know, this is something that SJWs do, right? They use this relativism to their advantage. Oh, well, everything's relative, except if your version of relativism disagrees with mine, then you're oppressing me.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's all that power dynamic thing. Yeah, this was something that came out even before the film came out when there were previews, and it showed Batman holding the bat shotgun or something. I forget exactly what that weapon turned out to be. I think he's using it in the battle against Doomsday, but then it turns out it's not even a shotgun. I think it's like
it's the gas, it's the kryptonite gas.
Yeah.
And that's why he uses it against Doomsday, because Doomsday is made from Zod, who would be vulnerable to kryptonite.
Yeah. Right, yeah, and he originally uses it against Clark, and it was just funny because I remember seeing some people who went and pulled up like old covers from Batman comics where he's holding a shotgun, and in that case, it actually is a shotgun. I mean, there are points in the history of the character where he.
Well, isn't it funny that Snyder partially based this movie on the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns, which people celebrated for its darkness and grittiness, and then all of a sudden Snyder, who we know has a relationship with Miller all the way back to 300 and is influenced by him, suddenly Snyder makes a dark and gritty movie, and all of a sudden what we celebrated with The Dark Knight Returns is no longer worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, yeah, especially, I mean, there was so much hate against the opening sequence of Batman versus Superman, which for me was very, very
That was
strong.
Like the best sequence of the entire movie.
I mean, I like it better than anything in Man of Steel, to be fair, but I also am more of a Batman person than a Superman person. But yeah, I was like shaking after that. I was like, oh, that's so good. And people were like mocking it. And I was like, I mean, I saw people pointing out at the time, it's like, that was like almost a shot-for-shot remake of The Dark Knight Returns. Like, that was not him. And they're like, oh, who is this? What's his name? I forget Bruce's dad's name, but, you know, the adult Batman's dad. Someone Wayne.
Thomas Wayne?
Thank you, Thomas. There we go. Yeah. Why is Thomas Wayne like suddenly this like guy who's gonna like punch the dude and like get his family killed and blah blah blah? And I'm like, yeah, it's different. I mean, it was different when Frank Miller did it. It was a different take, but it's not. I mean, people want to make all these claims like, oh, this or that is like not canon or something like that, and it's like, no, that's just verbiage.
Yeah, because my understanding of comic books is I understand the idea of canon. You know, I'm a sci-fi guy. I grew up on Star Trek. I understand the idea of canon, but my understanding of comic books is there's lots of what if and alternate universes.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, they go through basically every possible iteration, and there's not that much internal consistency, and yeah, it's very selective for sure. So I think we saw the same thing happen with Suicide Squad, as we saw with Batman versus Superman, in terms of re-editing or cutting the movie differently, and then I wouldn't say it's unlike Batman vs. Superman. It didn't make it unintelligible. The theatrical release made perfect sense, but it was just kind of okay. But then when you see the extended version, it's like it's a completely different film. I mean, it has way more meaning in it. It has way more psychological complexity for the characters. And in my opinion, it's quite good.
Yeah, that scene with Harley Quinn, what is it, where Joker pushes her into the acid or whatever, like it's so they had that in the trailer.
It's very different,
but it's so much better, and it's more in line with the philosophy of Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman in the director's cut. And as far as Suicide Squad, I think it even goes beyond what was actually shot. because I believe it was in the post-production process of Batman versus Superman when Jeff Johns started getting involved, and he was obviously then involved with the production process of Suicide Squad, as well as Zack Snyder was, because remember the Flash sequence in Suicide Squad where he captures Captain Boomerang, that was shot by Zack Snyder. I don't know if people remember that, but he shot that on set of Justice League and sent that to what's his name? David Ayers? Yeah, David. He sent it to David Ayers, and Ayers put that in. That's a Zack Snyder footage. I mean, likewise, there's rumors, and I truly believe that Zack Snyder helped Patty Jenkins direct part of Wonder Woman. I mean, if you look at the No Man's Land sequence, that's very similar to a Snyder sequence. I mean, it's very similar to the trenches in the
Sucker Punch.
Right, that's exactly what I was just going to say, is Sucker Punch. And if you look at what they did with specifically Joker and Harley Quinn, is that's supposed to be an abusive relationship. And even in the DVD, it's not really an abusive relationship because they wanted to make it more marketable for the mainstream. So we see how studio meddling occurred even in the pre-production process for Suicide Squad. I mean, to make that relationship non-abusive is just tragic.
Well, it's funny because that in and of itself is kind of sick, right? And I think you see that a lot with the SJW stuff, where it's like on the surface, it sort of seems like they're trying to address something that's an issue like rape or like domestic violence or something like that. But then when you get into kind of the details, or you look a little bit below the surface, it's like, no, you're actually like glorifying a lot of this stuff that's really like bad for people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's what they do all the time, and what they did with, I mean, Justice League. We'll get to that in a second, but I mean, I think that's definitely what they did with Justice League.
Yeah. So before we jump to that, I want to ask real quick, did you see anything like this happening with Wonder Woman, or do you think that somehow that escaped meddling because girl power or female privilege or something? I personally didn't get, I mean, there's one thing in Wonder Woman where I just kind of felt like, and I didn't get a studio interpretation, a studio meddling feel from it. I just got maybe the people writing this just like aren't the very top tier. But I did feel like the conclusion sort of at the end of like love being just was kind of seemed generic.
Yes.
In a way that didn't fit with the rest of the series.
Yes.
And it didn't seem like the right word. It didn't seem to fit even with the rest of the film. But I didn't get as much of a studio meddling vibe with that. For some reason, I just wrote it off to like, oh, I think the people who write this movie are just kind of basic.
Well, I want you to look up something right now while I talk about what exactly you've hit exactly the problem with Wonder Woman. And while I talk about it, I want you to look up, and I want you to confirm for me right now, because I don't want to seem like I'm lying or anything. Was Jeff Johns credited as a screenwriter on Wonder Woman? Because I believe he was. Now, here's the thing about Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman, story-wise, credit to Zack Snyder. And I don't mean I'm giving him credit. I mean, he has the credit for that. That is the parallel, literally the parallel story for Man of Steel. So we have an alien and we have a god, and they have parallel stories. That's intentional. And then you get to the end of Wonder Woman, and it has this incredibly shallow message. Fight for what you believe in, and what I believe in is love. Now, if we take the general culture, we interpret love to mean selfless love, altruistic love, the idea of giving yourself for other people. But if we take that and we consider for a second that Snyder wrote the story, and that this was intended as a companion piece for Man of Steel, and we're trying to create, a god and an alien, and then the man who mediates between them and becomes an integral part of Justice League, Batman, the human, which was how he was integrated in with Batman versus Superman, and then he would have been in Justice League with Wonder Woman. We saw hints of that relationship in the Whedon-Johns version. If you consider that, we can look at what happens at the end, and we can figure out what she means by love. In Batman versus Superman, before Superman dies, he says to Lois, "This is my world. You are my world." This is not a sacrifice. This is him saying, if I love you and I love this world, I have to fight this man or this beast that will destroy the world if I don't. Otherwise, I am not living in line with my values. Chris Pine does a similar thing when he dies in Wonder Woman. Yeah. He is not giving his life. He is saying, I'm protecting today so you can protect tomorrow. Because what he has learned from Diana is fighting for what you value. And he says the best way I can protect this world as a soldier is to help you protect this world in the future, Diana. And that's why he dies. He doesn't give his life. He does the best thing he can with his life given the context. It is an intentional parallel to Superman's death. And this is how he was inspired by Diana, by Wonder Woman. And we see how throughout Snyder's work, he always has the men being inspired by the women, right? I mean, Diana in this movie for Steve Trevor is echoing the way Martha Kent in Batman vs. Superman is telling Clark, be their hero, be their god, or be none of it. You're not obligated. You can do whatever you want. That's the same way that Diana is inspiring Steve. She's shown him a love he has never seen before. And that's what's being referred to by love. It's this maternal love that psychologically reinforces the power and values that we have in the world. And that subtlety is completely taken out. And all the way to Justice League, it's completely taken out to the point that Steppenwolf is just referring to the mother boxes as mother when we're supposed to be shown the negative side of motherhood in that movie. And that's just completely taken out. That's what was going for. And I truly believe that's because Johns used the studio mandate to make these movies more marketable to undercut as much of the philosophy as possible.
Yeah. And you know how sad that makes me, because I wouldn't exactly call it an issue with Snyder, but I do think Snyder doesn't address, let's call it toxic femininity.
I don't know.
Or yeah, the dark side of motherhood. He hasn't generally, but I completely agree that was his intention.
Right. I don't know.
His original vision of Justice League, and I would have loved to see that.
Right. I don't know how true this is, but I read that originally Steppenwolf's mother was supposed to be trapped inside the mother boxes, and that's why he's calling it Mother. And that was like that was his motivation. Which, I mean, that the fucking, like, are you kidding me?
It's not just that, right? Because he's like related to Darkseid as well.
Well, right, he's trying to prove himself to Darkseid.
Yeah.
Wait, so a man who has issues with his mother is constantly trying to prove himself and has self-esteem issues? No, right, that's not psychologically realistic.
Right.
And they took all of that out.
Yeah. Seems like. So to answer your earlier question, on IMDb, I do not see a writing credit for Jeff Johns on Wonder Woman. He does have an executive producer credit, though.
I remember reading an article early on that said that he was getting screenwriting credit.
It could just be that this isn't listing all of it, but yeah, I don't see him on there. I see
Alan it's the same thing
Zack
with
Snyder, Jason Fuchs, and William Moulton Marston.
Yeah, I mean, I'll Google in a second when you're talking, but it's the same thing with Justice League. Like, the rumor I read is that he was the one who wrote all the Superman scenes that Whedon shot,
which were the worst.
Right.
That was such a bad part of the movie. Yeah, that's one of the really, really obvious ones that, I was saying the scales completely tipped with Justice League to the point where it was obvious to everyone that something fucked up was going on behind the scenes. I mean, no one could have possibly missed that with that movie. And so before we talk about, I don't know, Superman's mustache or whatever, which is definitely, that was a big part that stood out, was the Superman scenes just being weird for people. Can you lay out for people what happened on that film? Like, when Snyder finished shooting, what was done by the time he left, and then what kind of stuff were they trying to cram into the 6 months before release after they brought in Joss Whedon?
Okay, you're going to have to repeat that in a second because I found a quote here. It's from comicbook.com. It's an article, Jeff Johns' role in Wonder Woman explained. And this is from the article. On the Wonder Woman set, Kurt Kanemoto, vice president of production for Atlas Entertainment, was asked about Johns' role in the production of the film. Kanemoto didn't hesitate in revealing just how important Jeff Johns really is to Wonder Woman. This is the quote from Kanemoto. Jeff Johns, is one of our executive producers, and he's, of course, writing on this film. He's been an amazing part of the core team, along with Chuck Roven, Debbie Snyder, and Zack Snyder as producers in this core team, along with John Berg. So I did read it. I guess it's an uncredited rewrite. I mean, that happens, right? We saw this in the recent Salma Hayek thing where she was told by the evil Harvey Weinstein, I'm not saying that facetiously, I believe the man is evil, to get a rewrite of Frida, and she had Ed Norton do an uncredited rewrite. So uncredited rewrites are pretty conventional in the movie industry, especially when you're doing it on set. So yeah, Jeff Johns, uncredited rewrites in Wonder Woman, and I believe uncredited rewrites in Justice League.
Gotcha.
Just wanted to prove that point. So if you want to...
No, that makes perfect sense too. And I mean, it kind of does make me sad because I didn't have that I liked the Wonder Woman movie, but everyone was so over the moon about it, and I just didn't quite get there. And that was kind of the main reason that I was like, oh, I feel like this is building towards something, and then it was like, yeah. Built towards something kind of conventional.
Very hand wavy at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So on Justice League, the question was, what just sort of mechanically in terms of the production of the film happened as you understand it? What had Snyder finished shooting? When did that happen? What had he done by the time he left? And then what all was Whedon trying to cram into the 6 months before release after he came on board?
Okay, so this is complicated, and this has a lot to do from piecing things together from social media, all of that kind of things. But based on my understanding, to give a broad overview, there is a Snyder version of the movie which may have lower quality visual effects and less score work done. But the way the film works is he shoots it, there's pre-production, you shoot a film, then you have post-production. In post-production is where you do finishing touches on the coloring of the edit, the visual effects, the sound, the score, all of those things. So filming was done in mid-November for Justice League. This is on, most notably, Jason Momoa's social media, where he says filming is done. Then, in February, as shown on Larry Fong, who Zack Snyder usually works with. He's Zack Snyder's usual DP, but he was working on the Abomination of the King Kong movie instead, which, by the way, looks beautiful, but is a piece of shit. If you want to know why King Kong Skull Island looks amazing, is because Larry Fong was the DP on it. Larry Fong tweeted out that Zack Snyder was in post-production doing color gradation. And there's a picture of Snyder in a color gradation studio, and if you Google the name of the company, you can find that that's what they do. And Larry Fong said that somebody asked him, they tweeted at him, and they said, well, why is the movie not coming out until November? And he was like, well, there are other elements to do. There is picture lock, and the reason it's not coming out after picture lock is that we have to do things like score and sound and all of these things. And picture lock is when you have the sequence you want and you have the cuts you want and everything. So that means the pacing is not going to change, because you can't hand it to the composer and have him make it with his cues like, okay, I'm going to have the beat come in here, and he does music, right? So he does, the time codes of music. His time code has to line up with the time code of the video. So you can't have him make his music and then, by the way, I changed the movie. Change the picture, because then the beat will come in later, right? Can you imagine if there's a beat as Superman snaps out Zod's neck and there's a dark beat, a dark tone, and then you change it and the dark tone comes right before? Horror movies use this to their advantage all the time with sound editing. They have jump scares by it too early or too late. So that's why there has to be a picture lock. And then you do things like you fix the dialogue. Well, again, Jason Momoa and Snyder showed sequences or showed when Snyder was doing ADR with the actors. ADR is far along in the process. ADR is when you go into a studio, sort of like animation, and you record their voices so you can dub it over their dialogue. So they watch their sequence in the movie and they say their line, but because the sound wasn't the quality the director wanted it, when whoever the sound guy captured it with either the boom or the lav or however they're miking it, they didn't like that, or the director didn't like that, so they go in and ADR them, which is like animation. That's far along in the process. So the one thing that in my mind and in my base of knowledge may not be complete is visual effects. Because why is a studio going to pay millions of dollars for high quality visual effects for a movie that's not released till November? You're going to do that last because that's going to cost the most money. But then there's an issue with the Snyder movie. As we've seen all the way back to 300, definitely in Sucker Punch and definitely in other sequences in the DCEU, is Snyder shoots on green screens. And he is a very meticulous storyboarder, almost like a painter. And it's like animation. And this thing about being an animation, this is... I got this information from a an Oscar-nominated documentarian about how this is handled. When you're doing backgrounds like that, so in animation, right, Disney will, at least back in the day, I'm assuming they do something similar on the computer stuff with Pixar and their modern stuff, you would draw the characters in one set of artists and backgrounds in another, and then you would put them together. It's the same thing here, where Snyder's shooting everyone on a green screen, but he knows ahead of time what the background's going to be, and that's being developed concurrently by a visual effects company. And there's no way you can put together a picture lock, and there's no way you can shoot these things if the visual effects of that aren't done. So gotcha. A large element of the visual effects have to be done simply because you can't make the movie otherwise, and you can't deliver the 3-hour cut, which he supposedly did in March, when, then he stepped down because of his daughter committing suicide. We can talk about that in a second and get that timetable down. But as far as the Snyder one, I really believe the only thing that isn't done is the high quality visual effects that he had to get approval for when he submitted his 3-hour cut in March to the studio. If you look at what he did, November finished shooting, February in the post-picture lock color gradation studio, and then, sorry, my cat's talking right now. She's upset as well. In the color gradation in February, then in a beginning of middle of March, you're in ADR. You're going to tell me he didn't have a complete cut? Maybe it wasn't refined. Maybe it's not blockbuster ready, but he had a more than watchable cut that he had to deliver. He had to deliver. I mean, just think of like deliverables in a studio. You don't deliver a half-ass cut of a $250 million movie to the studio to watch.
Right. So essentially you think that was pretty darn close to a complete film done by the time that Snyder left the project. Although, yes, things here and there may have needed to be finished. But that kind of gives you, too, an idea of the amount of time that needs to be spent on stuff. So the fact that Whedon came in and then did reshoots was, surprising to begin with. But then once the film came out and we saw the extent of the reshoots, that was, mind-blowing pretty much, right?
Yeah, part of the reason his reshoots were able to get done is a lot of them were minimal special effects. A lot of them were very TV-based. I basically put it this way, that Whedon shot a TV episode, which Whedon shooting and delivering a TV episode in 6 months isn't inconceivable, considering his experience with producing all of these shows. When you produce TV shows, you have, a very strict schedule where you shoot one a week and then it gets edited and everything. So he has experience with that. But if you look at what happened, the initial trailers, that's the quality of Snyder's footage as far as I'm concerned, because those trailers had sort of not great special effects like on Cyborg and such, but those were all the initial trailers were all very Snyder, with lines and the action and the way it looked. It was all very Snyder. Then in April or late March, after he showed his cut, I'm sure, he stepped down. And you can maybe talk to this more than me, but to me, him stepping down was very corporate being fired, where it was, oh, well, we're going to say you resigned because your daughter committed suicide. It's a very nice way of firing him without firing him. And the first thing is, his friend, Greg Silverman, moved laterally to a new project in Warner Brothers. And new people took over at the head of Warner Brothers. So now remember, no one didn't protect him in Batman vs. Superman, and we only got the Ultimate Edition. We got the shitty cut in theaters. Now, his other buffer, Greg Silverman, is gone. And we get the cut we get of Justice League, which is we bring Joss Whedon in, and we cut down from 3 hours to 2 hours. And of the 2 hours, if you consider about 45 minutes of those Joss Whedon, all they basically did was use Snyder film as connective tissue and necessary evil, because we already shot this and spent the money on it. So Joss, we're going to give you the challenge of making a new movie with this footage that's already been shot. And then, of course, as we've discussed earlier, they focused on really changing the Superman parts of it.
Right.
Which is why we had this very famous, that everyone knows about, oh, Henry Cavill has a mustache for, what was it, the new Mission Impossible?
Yeah.
Yeah, Henry Cavill has a mustache for the new Mission Impossible. So we're going to spend millions of dollars cutting that mustache out digitally.
And that's where it gets into the area where I'm like, I don't understand any of this as a business decision. Everything I've read has said there were concerns. There was, the merger was coming down the pike, which I think is now complete. And so, somehow it had something to do with that. They really just needed a big success. But they had Wonder Woman did well. Batman vs Superman didn't do as well as they wanted, but it's not like it lost money. And for some reason, though, they thought the best solution to this was not just to do something that was very technically difficult in the time frame, making a whole new movie in 6 months, but also very expensive. I mean, it had to increase the cost of the film pretty significantly to do this. And whatever scoring had been done, I mean, it sounds like that was thrown out, right? And they brought in Danny Elfman, and they had to bring all the actors back, and they had to do everything again, essentially.
Right, and when you're talking about scoring, you're not going to tell me the score wasn't done when the initial trailers all used the Come Together cover in them, and then that was just over the final credits. Where again, it was like, oh, well, we used this, we might as well put that in there because we paid for it. Like, you don't get that far along and including that. I mean, there was even a music video for the guitar player who covered that with Junkie XL. He released that on his channel. The guy doesn't go into production on a music video if he's not told this is going to be in the movie.
And I gotta say, it was jarring, even just having it in the credits. Yes. I mean, it stood out that I was just like, this doesn't fit. Like, there aren't a lot of times. The other time this happened to me was on V for Vendetta. The closing credits song is like that Rolling Stones song, like Fighting in the Streets or something. I forget the name, but it felt really out of place, and I was just like, did they run out of time, or like did they just really like this song so they wanted to put it in? But that's like the only other time I can remember being as jarred by a closing credits song.
Yeah, and emotionally, it didn't help me because you get to the end where they clearly cut up that Lois speech, which was originally from the Snyder Cut, clearly, because that was very philosophical, and the light thing parallels all the way back to the beginning of Batman versus Superman, where he's talking about I fell out of the light and they're diamond absolutes and all of that, and that clearly bookends that and parallels back to that. And again, we have the power of femininity with Lois and her love for Clark. So it was very much, you can see the elements of Snyder, and then you go from that where you're going, fuck you, that's what I could have seen. And then they hit you again with what Snyder does because he loves using remixes and hard rock remixes of pop songs. It's like, they're just so, and this is the thing, Dr. Drew on the Adam and Dr. Drew podcast always talks about the biggest thing is hubris. That's his biggest critique of society. I think it goes hand in hand with narcissism. I mean, maybe you can follow up on this a little bit. But the one answer for why they did these things and why the studio did this was hubris. I believe that Jeff Johns was in their ear saying, oh man, I was the one who fixed Wonder Woman. Did you see what I did? Oh, did you see what I did? Oh, and Snyder's version is all wrong. And they probably watched the version of Snyder Justice League, and they had misgivings with it. And then Jeff Johns jumped in and used his manipulation skills to make that happen. And it's the hubris of the studio believing, oh, well, we have enough money. We can just throw money at this and it'll fix the problem and we'll get $1 billion like Marvel does. That's the only business way I can explain it. And it's somebody taking advantage of that hubris, which I believe is Jeff Johns.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be the first time that something like that has happened, and I in the corporate world, and I don't mean in something that's viewed as subjective like film. I mean, there are plenty of very objective projects and products and things like that that have seen a similar path toward destruction. And then also just interesting things that can happen with like communication up and down the chain, and everyone, there's always a big debate about kind of what does the customer want, right? Like you think that a lot of people who don't work in business tend to think that the way it works is like you figure out what the customer wants, then you make what the customer wants, then you deliver it to the customer, and then step 3, profit, or 4, I guess, in that scenario. And that can work, but usually it's not that. I mean, no one wanted an iPhone before there was an iPhone, and now no one can live without an iPhone, right? And so the true creativity is in creating the thing that no one even realizes, that even the target buyer doesn't realize that they want. And I think that that's something that people are really not comfortable with in film, which I understand because of how big the budgets are. But it becomes very like cookie cutter, very like, we need to find this thing that was successful last time, and then usually totally misidentify what made it successful. Like you and I have talked about this before with Breaking Bad is a very frustrating one, right? Where Breaking Bad was hugely successful, and then a bunch of producers and people with money look at it and they're like, okay, so we should make more shows about drugs. Or we should make more shows of like, normal people descending into criminality, or we should make more shows. And they basically hit on every single thing other than the things that actually made it successful.
Yeah, I mean, what's that new NBC sitcom? I forget what it's called, but it's the three women who start robbing a grocery store because their lives suck. I mean, it's very much Breaking Bad, except women just becoming robbers, basically. I mean, it's the same. It's a very concrete bound mentality. But actually, what you're saying actually resonates with Snyder on two levels. Where one, what you're talking about is exactly what happened with 300. It happened with me in 300. It changed my life. And what I mean by that is, I remember the marketing all over MySpace, the banners and everything with 300. And I was like, they are killing me with this advertising. I was like, this is overkill. This looks like generic studio schlock. This looks terrible. And then I went in and I saw it and I go, what the fuck? This is like the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then since then, I've ended up here. So as we see, it's changed me. I'm wearing a Snyder t-shirt right now. You know what I mean? That I made in a podcast that I wouldn't have made otherwise. So that's what they did. They delivered something with Snyder. And the way they were able to do that artistically is because of Snyder's approach, where he has said his primary audience is himself. And that's the same thing with Steve Jobs. He didn't make the iPhone because he thought other people would like it. He said, you know what? I want to see this be real, and then sold it to people, and other people wanted it as well. That's what people don't get about being a creative person and being an artist. And this is what I tell students when I tutor. I go, did you enjoy writing this essay? No. Well, they say no, and then I go, why do you think I'm going to enjoy reading it then? If you're bored writing it, why is anyone else going to be bored, or why is anyone else going to enjoy reading it? And it's the same thing. They're making something, studio executives, that they don't enjoy just because they think it'll be sold. But you're going to tell me they sit there and they enjoy that? Yeah. And they go, oh yeah, I enjoyed that. Let's sell it. No, they sit there and they go, oh, that's marketable. Let's sell it.
Yeah, you're absolutely like spot on about 300, because it's weird because 300 came out. I mean, it came out, for instance, after Sin City, right? Sin City was unexpected. Stylistically, Robert Rodriguez is another director that you and I both really like. He was the one who kind of got Frank Miller to kind of open up to the idea of his work being translated to film, because he was understandably skeptical about it.
Well, because Frank Miller's a recluse, because he knows what happened to Snyder could happen to him at any moment. Yeah.
Yeah, well, naivety is not something that I think anyone could ascribe to Frank Miller. I think he was born aware of a lot about the world. But yeah, so I mean, so it's kind of weird because 300 did come out in the middle of what I'd call like this like stylistic boom in movies, where, before The Best You Could Hope For was like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man, which I did like. I thought it was fun and it was true to the comics and whatever. But then you had this pivot where it was like, no, we're going to do like intense stuff now. Right, we're gonna like oversaturate, and we're gonna like do slow motion action, and we're gonna have like ultra violence and like all kinds of different ways. And Snyder kind of came in the middle of that, which maybe made it seem, to me, and I wasn't exposed to the online advertising for 300, but I had no interest in seeing it. I knew the comic, I'd read the comic, I liked it a lot, and I was just like, no, it's not going to translate well, and this is just another in a long line of these, stylized things at this point that I've seen. And then when I find, and then someone from my dorm went to see it and was like, no, you're wrong, you need to see it. I still didn't go because I was busy. And when I finally saw it, I was just like, oh man, biggest mistake of my life probably is like not seeing this movie in a theater. I mean, it's like, it's an improvement on the comic for one. Like Sin City is a very good translation of the comic. I wouldn't quite say it's an improvement, but I can't imagine anyone, no matter how comic snobby you are, watching 300 and being dissatisfied with it in any way. And it wasn't just it wasn't just that visually it was so incredibly strong. It was also like it might be the best writing that I've ever seen, at least out of writing that's trying to take that minimalist approach. right? Like there's very little dialogue. If you counted up all the words, I don't think there are very many of them in the movie. So every single word and every single line is like packed with meaning. And it's just perfectly done in this, it's like this amazing, like mythological, just like origin story of Western civilization that I haven't seen paralleled anywhere. Unfortunately, I'd say I haven't seen it paralleled by Snyder himself. So I would like him to make another thing that hits me as strongly as 300 did and still does. But yeah, it was, I wish it had, one thing that's weird about it is I kind of wish it had had more of an impact. And that seems weird to say because obviously it launched his career. You know, lots of people like it. They still talk about it. A bunch of SJWs on the internet are now blaming it for the rise of the alt-right and Trump or something. So
that's what I was just going to say is we've seen posts, they're looking back and now they're saying, oh, well, we could have seen how evil Snyder was back then. And they're associating him with this package deal they present of the alt-right or all Nazis.
Which is all like a bunch of nonsense. And 300 is like, it seems, if you're an idiot, I guess, and you watch it and you don't pay attention, of course you would think it's not a very subtle movie, right? Because it's like giant dudes with giant abs in like little underwear thing, like screaming and, you know, very exaggerated, like villains. Like visually, it's not very subtle, but in terms of the story, like it addresses everything. I mean, people are like, oh, you shouldn't glorify the Spartans because they had slavery. And I'm like, if you pay attention, that is actually addressed in the movie. Like the moral ambiguity of the heroes and the villains in it is actually in there. But it still makes the case.
That's something Snyder said.
For one side versus the other.
He said that.
Well, you think Frank Miller is going to write something that doesn't have like subtlety in the morality? It's like, come on.
Yeah. When Snyder talks about his movies, he says all of his movies have an irony before Man of Steel. He said Man of Steel was his first one. The irony of Man of Steel is there is no irony. But he said the irony of 300 is that they're fighting for freedom when they have fucking slaves in their society and they're not free either. Which, I mean, is a commentary on our society. You idiots, that's what he's telling you.
Right, yeah. Well, and he really got the source material because that was Frank Miller's point in writing the story, right? Like, I love what he said about it. He was saying that the Battle of Thermopylae should be retold by every generation. And I love that too, because that's a very Jordan Peterson thing now, right? With like, you know, people revisiting these Old Testament stories and kind of finding new meaning from them. It's like, yeah, this is exactly what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take these stories because there's a whole bunch of different directions you could take it in. There's a lot of different stuff you could learn about it. And what you need to pull out of these stories depends on your current context.
Wow. I mean, that just goes right back to the beginning of the conversation where we're talking about different interpretations of Batman versus Superman and all these characters. And I mean, that's what he wrote this arc for. You know, the second Batman versus Superman was all about how we hate the heroic and we see it as a threat and we make people feel bad about being heroes. That I believe he even said in pre-production or at some point that he thought about how if Superman saved a cat from a tree, people would be upset nowadays. Like, what you're saying, it just beautifully wraps back to what we were saying in the beginning.
Cool. Well, I guess that's my cue to wrap it up. All right. So to summarize, Geoff Johns.
That wasn't my intent, but.
So Geoff Johns is, I think I asked you before if he was Ellsworth Toohey. You said he's not quite that because maybe he's not intelligent enough or he's not quite deliberate enough.
Yeah, I don't think he's quite that. He's also more behind the scenes. Toohey's more of a showman. But it's tough because Johns is a showman in the comic world. So. I don't know. It's really tough.
But he's our Randian villain for sure.
Well, we have several Randian villains. I mean, we have Geoff Johns. We have. I mean, look. Let's just combine them, right? Let me put it this way: if you combine Geoff Johns with Devin Faraci, you get Ellsworth Toohey. Devin Faraci is, of course, the blogger who did what Ellsworth Toohey did and wrote about how terrible Zack Snyder was and how he's a threat to art and all of these things. And then, of course, it was revealed that this guy assaults women.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like to think Toohey at least wouldn't rape anyone. I don't know. I'm a little glad that Rand didn't go down the sexual path with one of her characters because I don't really want to know what Toohey's sex life is like.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. Like, we talk about these villains and we say, like, Snyder villains and Rand villains are, like, caricatures. Like, yeah, good thing they're caricatures or they would be raping people. Like, that's what happens in real life here.
Yeah, in some ways, it gets actually a little toned down and whitewashed.
Yeah.
Because it would be very unpalatable to see the full reality.
Not to go on a tangent here, but you're going to tell me that Tui wouldn't have tried to use his power over Dominique sexually? You're going to tell me that?
Yeah, no, looking back, I almost think it's like missing from the book. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I should read it again.
No, it's not in there, but it would have made it more powerful that she would, if she gave herself to Tui willingly, but had to be forced upon by Rourke, that would have been much more dramatic.
That's true. Yeah. Well, Snyder is working on a Fountainhead movie.
Oh my God.
So if you're listening, Zack Snyder, here's an idea for you to like really, really piss off the audience.
You'll piss off everyone, Zach. You'll piss off everyone but the two of us right here.
Yeah.
You'll piss off the objectivists. You'll piss off the main culture.
I'll be totally on board with that. Yeah. And then on the other side of it, we have our Rourkean hero, Zack Snyder, trying to maintain his artistic vision in this world. And I think maybe we have Frank Miller as the, I don't remember the character's name, but the architect that Rourke studies under.
Yes.
Who had, was
Cameron?
Cameron, yeah,
Was
that's right.
Cameron?
Something Cameron.
Pulled that one out of nowhere.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, and I don't know. Then we have a whole lot of people.
Joss Whedon is Peter Keating.
Oh yeah. Thank you. Forgot about that. Yeah, this was. I mean, and that was something I called as soon as this happened. I mean, the idea of like taking out Zack Snyder and replacing him with Joss Whedon. Oh God, business wise, I sort of get it, because who else are you going to use at this point? Who else is a superhero movie person, right? But artistically, morally, philosophically, it was just like, wow, dude, like, I can't imagine. That's just, ugh. Oh, it made me sick.
Yes.
And then to have it couched, at the time, I thought Snyder was legitimately quitting because of his daughter's suicide. And I
did too.
And my other stuff on this channel, you guys have probably seen, I'm pretty harsh on not just mothers, parents in general. And I actually had made some harsh comments about him at the time for not quitting as soon as it happened. Because he does have other children. There's obviously some problem.
He's got like 8 kids. Well,
yeah.
The problem that needs to be addressed is that he didn't quit immediately. I mean, he said, "I'm going to finish this movie as catharsis."
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the problem. He's a workaholic.
He's a workaholic.
He said if he would
focused on him, not you don't get to have 8 kids and then one of them offs themselves and then you just keep working to cover up your pain. I still believe that. I still feel that way, but I do think it's another layer of grossness to me with the industry, which is already, I mean, how can it possibly get grosser at this point? I mean, yeah, I should probably make a video about the article you were referencing about Frida and what my girl Salma Hayek has come out with about that. More Harvey Weinstein, rapey grossness, blacklisting, blah, 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 blah. And
well, it goes hand in hand with this, because if you want an inside look at how the production process is manipulated by non-artists, just read that.
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes this whole thing with Snyder look innocent, right? Because I'm assuming that there wasn't like some executive at Warner Brothers who wanted to like butt fuck Zack Snyder and Snyder said no, and that's why all this happened, like.
Well, right.
I mean, it could be. He's an attractive guy, but.
but Snyder is protected from that because his wife produces all his movies.
Yeah, that's true. That's smart as well. Although maybe another problem for the children.
100%. Yeah. And it's a problem for him because that's another buffer he has.
Yeah.
Right? Snyder just wants to be left alone to make movies, but he's created these buffers to deal with the human side of things, quote unquote, the social side of things. And they all failed him basically because he got outdone by a master manipulator in Jeff Johns.
Yeah, which is, sometimes that just happens. But so taking all that into account as an aspiring artist yourself, what do you see as the path for people like Snyder or who are starting out, who want to put themselves in a position where they can stay true to their vision? Is it even an option in the industry anymore, or is it all the future is YouTube, or...
I would say a combination of both. Snyder is going to go back and do that. I just read an article today that says he's not going to be further involved in making any films. He's just going to get EP credits on the ones he already said he was going to, which is Wonder Woman 2 and Aquaman. So beyond that, he's done. And that means he's going to go back and do The Last Photograph, the war drama he's been waiting to make. And he's going to go back and do The Fountainhead and make the movie he was going to make. And it's just the story of how he got his break and the story of how Nolan got his break. And I think Nolan is more compelling. And what Nolan did was his first movie following, he, on weekends, saved money and shot scenes for that on weekends on his own. And then somebody saw it and thought he was marketable and gave him money and made the movie. So that's what I would say, especially in today's age where you can distribute yourself pretty cheaply. And this is what I'm going to do now. This is what I've decided to do now. And it's make stuff on your own, submit it to festivals, put it on YouTube, get as many eyeballs on it as possible, and make what you want to make and prove that people want to see it. If you prove that people want to see it, people will pay for it or people will invest in you. That's what Nolan did, and that's what Snyder did, and that's how they got to the top, and that's how why they've avoided these issues of the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, because they're not involved with that aristocracy of pull, as Ayn Rand would have called it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Justin. Reminder to everybody to go check out Welcome to the Midside podcast and themidside.com. How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse at howtozombie.com. And where else can they find you guys? You're on Twitter, you're on Facebook.
Well, howtozombie.com is gone. So just go to themidside.com and you can find it as one of the top 3 links. That website's down that's a whole other story. But maybe that will become dramatized one day and fictionalized one day, but that's a whole other story. You're going to go to themidside.com/podcast for the archives. You go to iTunes for the podcast. It's on Stitcher. It's on Google Play. Or if you want to reach out to me, I'm on any of the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, The Midside.
Cool. Thanks so much.